Hello music lovers, welcome to the video. Thanks so much for checking out this channel. And you know, about 20 years ago in July of 2000, I got to interview one of my all-time heroes, Steve Howe, the legendary guitarist for the band Yes, up in New York. It was on their Masterworks Tour, and I got to spend about 45 minutes with him. We had a great conversation, and I'm going to be sharing a portion of that with you here today. And also, you know, we're going to be answering some big questions, such as, how did Steve really feel about Trevor Rabin and the music he made with Yes? Which of Steve Howe's albums from the 80s turned out to be very disappointing? Also, what made Steve say this?
So I'm very unhappy with it, and you've raised a very sensitive topic.
Only time will tell how these and other heated moments will play out, so stay tuned. So yeah, one of my fondest memories ever was getting to meet and spend time with Steve Howe of Yes on their Masterworks tour when it came to Jones Beach in New York. I was living up in New York at that time, so not a big deal for me to drive out to Long Island and check out the show. I mean, this was an epic show. This is the tour where Yes pulled out some of their classic stuff that they hadn't played in quite a while, not since the mid-70s, like The Gates of Delirium and Ritual, plus they were doing Close to the Edge, The Heart of the Sunrise, Starship Trooper, an epic show. I remember there was some questions about the weather and John's voice, because he had canceled a couple of shows prior, but everything was good on this night. Kansas opened the show, and it was just a very memorable night. Loved this tour. I remember when I got to the venue, I went to Steve Howe's dressing room, and I knocked on the door, and he answered, and he asked if I could give him about a half hour because he had to meditate. That's what he usually does before shows. He just kind of calms everything down. But I was like, you know, look, man, you know, I didn't drive all this way for this. You know, let's get this shit going. I'm just kidding. I gave him time. I was like, sure, man, whatever you need. So I came back about a half hour later, and then he asked me if I wanted to go get dinner with him. So of course I was like, yeah. So we had dinner there. The thing was catered. And so I had dinner with him and I guess the road crew. I didn't see anybody else from the band. I didn't see anybody else from Yes in the backstage area. I must have been in Steve Howe's zone or something because there was nobody else walking around. But after dinner, you know, we had some light conversation and then went back to his dressing room and we talked there for about 45 minutes. And this is the first time that I've heard this interview in about 20 years because I thought it was lost, to be honest with you. I knew that I had it somewhere possibly, but I wasn't exactly sure. I thought I knew. And when I went through a bunch of stuff recently, I found it. I also found my interview with Chris Squire and Alan White from the year earlier. And I'll be getting to that at some future point, and a bunch of other things, other interviews and photos and everything. And so I'll be sharing that with you in due time. Then listening back to this interview, I realized how relaxed Steve was and how open and candid he was about a lot of different things. The first part of the interview, we talk about the Masterworks Tour, how they chose the songs, songwriting, his solo career. Second half of the interview was more about the bands that he was in, different side projects, especially through the 80s. And one of the things that I came to realize is how the 80s really weren't all that kind to Steve Howe. Of course, his band Asia had tremendous success in 1982. Their debut album was the biggest selling album of that year. But if you look outside of that, there was a lot of disappointment and even one point where he felt like it could have been his downfall, and we'll get to that. But one of the more sensitive areas that Steve had in the 80s was when he watched his old band Yes go on without him. I mean, imagine this. You're Steve Howe. You helped to establish Yes in the 70s, put his stamp on that band with his definitive guitar style. They break up in 1980, and now here we are a couple years later, and they're going on without him. And not only that, but to great success. I mean, Yes took off in the early 80s, had a #1 hit single. And so I asked Steve, you know, first of all, where were you when you first heard this brand new Yes music, and what did you think about it?
Well, I seem to remember I was on tour with Asia when I first ever heard an early tape of, you know, the finished album. So I guess we got on with it, if you like, quicker. We started sooner, if you like, on Asia than they did on reforming Yes. But there's not a lot I can say other than I didn't like it. What I heard I didn't like because I wasn't ready for the group to change, because, in actuality, I don't think it changed that much when I joined, but obviously the world would disagree. But Peter Banks was a very good guitarist, and he played very well on those two albums, and it was very easy to follow him, because I was, it would have been very difficult if the guitarist had been really crappy in Yes, and I tried to follow it. It would have been, it might sound like it would have been easier, but there was a thread to carry on, and I kind of thought that Trevor didn't really, maybe, it wasn't his way, to kind of devise a way to keep that style. In other words, maybe bring a sort of Peter Banks, Steve Howe style into Yes. But with his confidence and his talent and things, of course, he brought Trevor Rabin into it. That's quite understandable, really. So, I didn't get off on it because I thought it was too hard, and Big Generator was too hard, and Talk was too hard. It's too tough, and in a way it was too ordinary as well for me. I thought, although there were some clever things in Generator, and all three albums had clever things in them, they didn't seem to have much yesness in them. But there was, that can't be said generally across them. But obviously it was the direction that didn't appeal to me. Although I was freer in thinking, you could sort of like Asia was doing God knows what by the second album, and I didn't like that either. So I wasn't really adhered to Asia as a security. Although I was very disappointed that it couldn't follow on with a great second record, because the first record's actually a very deep, very strong record. Had a lot of very fun work done on it, and that shows. And we liked the record when it finished, and that means a lot, I think.
So yeah, Steve Howe, as I said, being very candid about his thoughts on the Rabin years, saying that there were some clever things, but by and large it was very ordinary. And one of the things that I found interesting was how he said that Trevor Rabin didn't carry on the traditions that both he and Peter Banks had. Of course, Peter Banks was the first guitarist in Yes, the first couple of albums. Both of these guitar players brought in elements of jazz and blues into the band. And Trevor Rabin's more of a straight-up, strict rock guitarist. But, one thing that Steve missed here, to Trevor's credit, Trevor Rabin did not join Yes. Okay, he wanted to play with Chris Squire and Alan White and form a band. There was never any intention of forming Yes. It wasn't until the record executives got their hands on this whole project, John Anderson came into the fold. That's when they called it Yes, and this is when Trevor Rabin kind of inherited the Yes catalog and all the baggage that comes along with it. And then he's got Steve Howe calling him out for not playing like he did back in the 70s. So maybe, Steve, maybe you insulted Trevor a little bit. Kind of reminds me of that scene from Goodfellas, Come on, Jimmy, he's out of line. No. Insult him a little bit. You insulted him a little bit. Steve also touched on Asia and talked about how he was very proud of their debut album, but was very disappointed in the second album, Alpha. And I felt exactly the same way. I was even going to ask him about this anyway. I remember the very first Asia album, I thought had great songs. Of course, it had a couple of major hits with Heat of the Moment and Only Time Will Tell. And I did a whole video about this particular moment in Asia. I'll throw a link up to it. But, Steve had some brilliant guitar work on that album. It was my first entry into Steve Howe. I had never heard him before. So I had no point of reference, but I knew that the guitar work was just really, really great throughout. Second album, I Bring It Home, what a disappointment. The mix was not very clear. It didn't have any balls. Steve Howe's, also, I noticed that when I looked at who was writing the songs, it was all Wetton Downs, John Wetton and Jeff Downs. Whereas on the first album, I could see Steve Howe was in the mix with the songwriting. And so overall, I thought Alpha was a complete dud. So I asked Steve, what the hell happened between the first and second Asia albums?
I felt the same as you. Yeah, well, that went. Now we can look back, and even the people that thought they were doing the right thing can realise they weren't. And Carl Palmer and I were absolutely sure we were doing the wrong thing by just going with Wetton Downs songs and not looking at my music and any openings Carl could offer. So it's very disappointing to find that when you give somebody an inch, they take a mile. And that's kind of what happened in the production area, particularly where I knew that, you know, Mike Stone had done Journey, and then he'd done the first Asia record, and I knew he liked to blend Jeff and I together, which was a pretty good ingredient. But, you know, that's a good ingredient, but also getting the features right is also important, and getting the dimensions. So Only Really Don't Cry had anything like a mix, you know, a serious mix on it, where it was somewhat steered or adhered to the group's idea of it a little bit. But the rest of the stuff just came out sounding really dinky. And where's the guitar, and why's all this got reverb on it, and where's the drumming? So it was disappointing, because unfortunately at the time Mike just couldn't mix it in that same dynamic way, where the dynamics came through. They weren't there all the time in the first record. That's what dynamics are, you know. If you have the concept of dynamic all the time, where everything's blended, everything's got buckets of reverb, you know, it's going to sound huge, you know. Phil Spector, you know, did it, you know, and kind of maybe fortunately he didn't have digital reverb, but, you know, so GTR suffered a little bit with that as well, too much reverb for my liking. So, but what's the point? You know, I'm not really saying crying over spilt milk. It's just that these are the things I've learned. And when a group likes the record, when the group's around, as it wasn't really allowed to be on the second album of Asia, it was much more divisively designed. And I must say, somebody there kept saying, take the guitar off this and chop this off and keep the guitar. And it was like, who are you talking about? You know, so I was having a real war with the concept of being a blend artist as opposed to a feature artist, you know. And you hear me all over the first album, and it pays off. And you hear Jeff and I working together. So yeah, some things are disappointing, and at the time, you're young enough and stupid enough not to notice how important it is, you know. Or you fight it and you can't win, and then you say, well, I can't win here, so like chasing mixes of Union around the world, saying, where's it being mixed today? Oh, you're just leaving, I can't come to New York today because you're leaving New York to go to LA. You know.
Now, something else I talked to Steve about was this very unique period during Asia where John Wetton, the lead singer, left, and Greg Lake from Emerson, Lake and Palmer came in to take his place. And this was just in time for a tour of Asia, where they did this MTV concert, Asia in Asia, which was broadcast all over the world and of course released on home video. And what's also interesting as a side note is this year I got my hands on this bootleg documentary that I never even knew existed, called The Road to Budokan. And you wouldn't have known that this existed unless you happened to catch the MTV broadcast, and this aired a half hour leading up to the concert, but I never knew that it even existed. Some pretty cool footage of Greg Lake with the band. They even acknowledge that John Wetton left, and it's a pretty neat little era that only lasted about 15 minutes. So I asked Steve what was going on with John leaving the band, Greg coming in, Greg going out, John coming back, and then Steve exiting the band. What the hell's going on?
Well, you've summed it up. That's what happened. I don't think there's much more I can add to it. I mean, everything seemed to be a good idea with Greg for a while, and then it wasn't, and then he left, John came back, and we had 2 weeks of quite blissful fun, and then all of a sudden it was over again, and I didn't understand it at all. I got up and laughed and said, well, you know, I'm out of here. And, you know, I guess they needed me a bit more than they thought, because, you know, that wasn't actually the end of it, even though that was, as far as I was concerned, the end of it. But it kind of dragged on a little bit with me coming and going behind the scenes. And then, yeah, then I was really busy with GTR and didn't want to know. So, but you know, it's not so much about music really, because, you know, I can play with anybody who makes music, but it's what happens around that music and the atmosphere people bring, their willingness, their happiness, their clarity. You know, it depends what they're like, you know, and that's what maketh a musician, you know. It's something a lot of people don't pay much attention to, you know, in their own lives, because, you know, we can all go through life very bullish and think that there's no price to pay for this, you know. But some people really do carve up groups, and they range from musicians to managers to record people, and they've all been somewhat divisive, thinking that what they're thinking is actually going to make things a lot better, and what it does is collapse everything. Everything falls apart and everybody loses. That's generally the outcome of these high-flying executive style decisions of, let's do this to this, and then buy that and put that over here and give them this, and then everybody will be happy. You know, 6 months later, everybody's like in different groups. They're not even playing together anymore.
You know, one of the things that Steve Howe talks about here is how when record executives and everything get involved in bands, things start to get a bit screwy, and how people can wind up in different groups. And that's exactly what happened with his next band, GTR, which he already started talking about. This was another supergroup that he joined in the mid-'80s, and it was a band that was with Steve Hackett, his counterpart in another prog rock giant from the '70s, Genesis. And on paper, this looked great. You know, Steve Hackett and Steve Howe in the same band, but you have to remember that these two guitar players, they like to control the guitar landscape, let's say. They like to be in total control. So having them both in one band, it was only a matter of time before the wheels fell off, and they did. Steve Hackett wound up leaving, and so I asked Steve about this particular phase because there was going to be some continuation of GTR without Steve Hackett, and I asked Steve what happened during this era.
So that period is, if you can call Steve Howe and Friends, which is kind of what we thought we were just kind of trying it out. But then the idea kind of accelerated when Robert Berry replaced Steve Hackett kind of officially, or unofficially behind the scenes if you like, but officially behind the scenes. And then we did start to make a record, and then between management and Robert Berry, suddenly he's doing something else and everything stops again. So it was a really, Steve Hackett might have been laughing himself, you know, to sleep, you know, because we were floundering quite badly. And but there again, not because of the music, but because of the personalities and the mistakes and erroneous conclusions people draw from what they call their experience of things. And so that was a very big waste of time, and that was an extremely dangerous thing for me to do, waste my time. And but some projects you have to follow, you know, a certain length of time before you go, this isn't going right, jump off. But you know, foolishly I've stayed on a couple of them too long, and they've almost been my downfall, because at that time all the momentum and security you built up suddenly stops, you know. Then it's all worry again. So yeah, very dangerous thing to have done those things. But I guess that's quite a lot about me taking risks, you know, in music. I mean, if I didn't take any risks in music, I wouldn't be playing the music I did. So.
Yeah, so here Steve Howe talks about GTR and their debut album. I remember when that album first came out, I really was looking forward to it. I loved When the Heart Rules the Mind. I still think it's got some good stuff in it. The rest of the album, though, I think for the most part falls flat. There might be some cool moments. They made some pretty interesting use of guitar synthesizers, so that was a new toy that they were kind of playing with. But overall, it was a disappointment, and it's a shame that they couldn't keep on going and kind of, you know, flesh that whole thing out. But interesting that Steve Howe brings up Robert Berry and how he was in the mix after Steve Hackett left, and then he was kind of gone to another project. And I have a feeling what he's talking about there is when Robert Berry formed Three with Keith Emerson and Carl Palmer. And that was another band that came and went in 15 minutes. So yeah, when you look at all of this so far, Steve Howe watching his old band take off without him, you know, working with Asia, the second album, the politics of having to work with certain songwriting teams, and, you know, the production quality. And then of course you've got record executives coming in, carving up bands, wasting time. But we're not done yet. There's one other thing that really pisses off Steve Howe, and we're going to take care of this in some tales from topographic trivia. Okay, so what was Steve referring to when he told me this?
So I'm very unhappy with it, and you've raised a very sensitive topic.
All right, was he talking about A, Yes's live film projects, B, performing Trevor Rabin material live, or C, Asia's second album, Alpha? And the answer is A, Yes's live film projects. And this would include like Keys to Ascension and the House of Blues DVD, which came out in 1999. This is something that was just about to be released. And I remember reading at the time that he was not happy with the production and the mix. And I'll let Steve tell you more.
Well, what happened was we kept wondering why it wasn't being edited very well visually, and it was because they had a lousy mix. They couldn't tell what they were supposed to be looking at because you couldn't hear it that clearly. So I hit the roof a few times, and then eventually a mix came along. And I'm very unhappy with the mix. I mean, it's not an altogether good mix. It's, some things conflict totally with when I'm playing. I'm stuck on the left side. And this concept of filming and somebody else mixing is just really, to be honest, pissing me off, to put it mildly, because we've suffered it too much, and it's reminiscent of the 80s when the group doesn't have control over everything it does. Every sound that goes out is approved by the band. It's what the band want. That's the idea. That's why you're in a band. What the fuck are you in a band for if you're not going to make the music the way you want to? And there's no time it's clearer that that's the signal, that musicians are putting out. Again, we're not all making punk music, thank goodness, but we are all making music that's free-spirited, because we're not constricted so much. So, sorry about that outburst. Yeah, I mean, they re-edited it. Sometimes you see me when I'm playing a solo, sometimes you see somebody else. How can I put it? I've never fully supported Yes on these film projects we've done, Keys to Ascension, and this one the same. I've not supported them because that's the way we've gone about it that's wrong, and the lack of control we have over the sound, which is, after all, that's our business. We are sound. Yes equals sound. If we don't have a sound, we don't have a group. So I reckon that it's so annoying for me to have mixes going out. That's almost what happened with Keys to Ascension Volume 1 until I sat there for 4 weeks, 5 weeks and mixed it with the people, because I didn't want another live album to go out with some ropey sound. So, those things are quite difficult sacrifices to make, and somehow, after VH1, the Hard Rock, which was the most unsatisfactory live sound we've ever had. So we just, it's to me, it's Yes floundering, not getting the artistic bit right. I mean, that's our business. So I'm very unhappy with it, and you've raised a very sensitive topic.
So, of course, I asked Steve the golden question. Kind of reminded me of that scene in Spinal Tap when after they talk about the disastrous Stonehenge, Derek Smalls is like, so I raise a practical question at this point. Are we going to do Stonehenge tomorrow? So I asked Steve Howe, so are you going to record on this tour a live DVD? And this is what he had to say.
Yeah, we're recording Homedale, the show in Homedale, New Jersey, on, I don't know what day it is, next week sometime. Yeah, we're recording it, and also it's going to be filmed for a webcast sometime. Yeah, here we go again. It's every tour. Sometimes it's 6 times a tour. Romania, Bulgaria, somebody wants to film here in France. It's like, give me a break. We just don't need all this stuff. We just need one quality film, What it's used for is supposed to be for archive, our own archive more than anything else.
Now, what would be great is if Yes could dig into that archive and pull out a show from the Masterworks Tour, put it out on Blu-ray or DVD. That would be really, really cool. I know that they're not in John Anderson mode right now. That's a shame, and I talk about this in my last Yes video, The State of the Onion, and I'll throw a link up for that if you want to know how I feel about Yes nowadays. But overall, this was a great interview, and this is only a part of it. If you want to hear more, let me know. Drop it in the comments comments below. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, to let me know if you want to hear more from Steve. I also interviewed Chris Squire and Alan White. I found that interview too, and that was from the Ladder Tour the year before this up in Connecticut. And so I'll be featuring that at some point soon too. I interviewed John Anderson. I already put that up on this channel. That was from 2010. I'll throw a link up to that too. Steve was really cool, nice and relaxed, and he signed my copy of Fragile. Also, check out the companion playlist to this video. I've loaded it up with some of my favorite Steve Howe songs, some live Yes from the Masterworks Tour, the Asia documentary, and more stuff, so check that out. Link in the description below. Also, be sure to hit the subscribe button to be alerted for more videos that are going to be coming soon. And this video is going to come out right before Christmas, so I hope you guys have a great holiday, a Merry Christmas to those who celebrate, and I'll be back soon with more videos, all right? So stay tuned and take care.